Presidents Putin and Erdogan meet in Moscow and agree to strengthen relations. Is this just a partnership of convenience, or can Turkey and Russia become longer-term allies? How's that being viewed by Turkey's Western partners? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. They weren't speaking to each other less than 18 months ago. Now the Russian and Turkish presidents are praising their friendship. Vladimir Putin welcomed Recep Tayyip Erdogan to Moscow on Friday, with the war in Syria dominating talks. They seem to have reconciled their differences, with talk of renewed optimism about a possible peace deal in Syria. Putin hailed their joint efforts in Syria, while Erdogan said they've closed the gap to normalizing relations.
Neler yapabileceğimizi mütalaa ettik.
We are dedicated to take the historic and special relationship between Turkey and Russia even further. Sadly, we have lost precious time because of the late 2015 incident that hurt us deeply. Yet, in the meantime, we have also seen that friendship between the two countries has the power to overcome all the tests, issues and provocations.
We are very happy that connections between our countries are being re-established quite quickly. Lately, we've been working actively on Russian-Turkish relations on a level that our countries are worthy of. We are actively working on solving the most pressing crises, first of all, the Syrian one.
The changing dynamics of the Syrian conflict have played a role in the rapprochement between Russia and Turkey. Relations soured when Turkish forces shot down a Russian warplane in November 2015. Moscow responded to the lack of an apology with economic sanctions. Turkish agricultural exports were banned in Russia, and Russian tourists stopped going for holidays in Turkey. And when Turkey's president apologized a few months later, that was the start of their reconciliation. It's continued with cooperation on the war in Syria and backing a ceasefire last December. They've also signed a new economic cooperation plan and agreed to create a $1 billion investment fund. Well, let's bring in our panel now. From Istanbul, we have Metin Gürçen. He is a columnist at El Monitor's Turkey Pulse and a former Turkish military advisor. Joining us from Moscow, Sergei Strokan, a columnist and political commentator at the Kommersant newspaper. And lastly, from London, Lilit Gevorgyan, who is a country risk analyst and former attaché in the Armenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, all of you. Metin Gürçen, Turkey and Russia have come a long way, haven't they, since November 2015, when the Turks shot down that Russian jet and there was things had reached an all-time low. What do you put this improvement down to?
Let me start with an overall analysis to set the stage. I think there are three dynamics shaping the strategic relationship between Turkey and Russia. First one is, U.S. withdrawal, gradual withdrawal from wider Middle East involving Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, Middle East, and even Black Sea region, Turkey and Iran. So U.S. in security terms has been withdrawing force. And this withdrawal causing or creating power gaps in the wider Middle East to fill. This is the first factor. And also the increasing rift or a crack between the Western security bloc in general and Turkey, and U.S. and Turkey in particular. This crack has been very visible nowadays because of the, U.S. and Western allies, traditional allies, stance just after the July 15 coup attempt, and their insistence on the cooperation with YPG, PKK-affiliated YPG forces in the north of Syria. So this causes big question marks in Ankara's mind. And the second factor, right now we have to concentrate on Iran's increasing profile in the region, trying to fill those power gaps. As a capable security actor, Iran has been wisely filling its unconventional deterrence, gaps by those, conventional deterrent gaps with those unconventional means such as its proxies, local militias, and ambitious ballistic missile program and nuclear program. So this is the second factor, I think, causing this cooperation between Russia and Turkey, the need for a balance of Iran. And the third and the most important factor is the ISIS issue, and all actors right now in the region, particularly the regional players such as Turkey and Iran, and also the global players, Russia and US, instead of turning back to the pre-ISIS status quo with a revisionist stance, they want to prove their agency on the post-ISIS setting. So these are the important factors, I think, dominating or shaping the strategic relationship between Russia and Turkey.
Sergei Strokhan, how has this relationship between Turkey and Russia evolved in your view?
If we look at Russian-Turkish relations, we can see that the pendulum was swinging widely from one side to another, and we've seen that there's only one step from love to hatred. If you ask me, I would say that I could have imagined that the things would turn such a dramatic way, because just few months ago we were awash in anti-Turkish propaganda with Russian official TV calling Turkey a terrorist sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East. And we remember how grim-faced President Putin appeared before Russian journalists, saying that it will be not only tomatoes which Turkey will have to pay the price for downing of Russian plane. So are we journalists cynical breed? So we used to joke that we Russians select the enemy of the year. So last year, first part of the year, the enemy of the year was Turkey, and now. In a dramatic turnaround, we see that now it is the friend of the year again is Turkey, and yesterday we've seen that at the press conference President Erdogan was calling President Putin my dear friend. Can you imagine? And we were awash in smiles and hopes and statements which are restricted not only security pattern, not only Syria, which was obviously high on the agenda, but are just for our audience to understand that both sides said that the ambitious goal is to bring our turnover to, can you imagine, $100 billion. At present, just for comparison, at present Russia's major trade partner is China, and with China we have much less than 100. Roughly we have around $65–70 billion. So that means that what is at stake is not only security issues, but trade and economic ties, which would enable both sides to capitalize on their position as Eurasian powers. Russia is posing itself as Eurasian power, Turkey as well. So there's an entire gamut of issues which we can go ahead with in cooperation, including nuclear cooperation. We are building an atomic station in Akua. Then we are reviving the project of Turkish Stream gas pipeline, bringing gas to Europe, which was put on hold. And other things, hundreds of thousands of Russian tourists are going to Turkey. So that's quite a lot of things to do together.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about those economic ties and the larger security issues in a moment. But if I can get Lilith Gevorgyan's view on this, do you think this warming of relations between Turkey and Russia right now is just a kind of convergence of interests in the current times, or do you think it's something deeper than that?
No, I think it's there is nothing new in the way the Russian-Turkish relationships are playing out. They are historically competitors in the region, and I think they will remain competitors. Since Russia emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they recognized that they have this competing interest with Turkey, but they also decided to decouple political diplomatic relationship from Turkey, often involving difficult issues, from the economic ties. Also, what we have seen very often, Russia and Turkey adopting quite strong worded statements against each other when they were at the height of confrontation, and then going back. But one thing that remained constant were the economic ties. And I have to say that even at the height of the confrontation, after the shooting down of the Russian jet, if you really closely look at the Russian sanctions, they weren't that serious at all. It only concerned the agricultural sector. Some of the Turkish companies that are involved in lucrative contracts in Russia, they remain. Banking sector didn't suffer at all. But more importantly, Turkey relies on Russian gas. 60% of Turkey's energy imports come from Russia, and nothing happened to that either. So I would say that we're really seeing it's quite normal to see this sort of warming of political relationships and then cooling down, but the underlying unifying theme in Russian-Turkish relationship is the economic relations and the complementary nature of this relationship, where you have Turkey as a net energy importer and Russia very much interested in exporting its energy to Turkey and via Turkey to Europe, and of course investing in some other areas of Turkey, like as the previous guest mentioned, building the first nuclear power station in Turkey. The Russians have already invested $3 billion in this project. So at the moment we're seeing convergence of both economic and political interests, but I do not discount that in the future we will see once again that Turkey perhaps returning that title of enemy of Russia.
Sergei Strokhin, if we look at what's happening in Syria right now with the conflict there, while Turkey and Russia have been sponsoring these ongoing talks aimed at peace there, the fact remains that while they're also joining forces in the fight against ISIL, but the fact remains Russia and Turkey are still backing opposing sides in the Syrian war. The Russians backing the Syrian government and Turkey backing many of these rebel groups. So how do they continue to cooperate with that in mind?
Well, I think that while today we're talking about the transformation of Russian-Turkish relations, so Syria is a textbook example of how the position of both sides was evolving. If we just look at what both leaders of Russia and Turkey were saying on Turkey, we've seen them totally different in less than 2 years. As you are aware, Russians were trying to do their level best not to allow President Assad regime to collapse, while while Turkish side insisted that there can be no room for President Assad in future of Syria. What we see today that both sides at least tried to bridge the gap in their understanding. I don't say that they already became partners, full-fledged partners. But now the difference is not that seen as it was a couple of years back. Specifically, Turkish side has cooled down its anti-Assad rhetoric, and you can hardly find a recent statement of top Turkish leader, including Erdogan himself, which would make special emphasis on the imperative of Assad departure. That's what Russia was expecting from Turkey. But again, the next step, which brought two sides closer, was the ceasefire, which was initiated last December. You know that Moscow and Ankara joined hands in sponsoring and throwing their weight behind both sides, stopping the hostilities, and this ceasefire holds. And after that, shortly after that, both Moscow and Ankara initiated the resumption of peace talks using Kazakhstan capital of Astana. The first round of talks was held in January, then in February. And after that, we've seen all sides coming to Geneva. So that was also a brainchild of both Presidents Erdogan and Putin, who at one point adopted complete opposite stand on Syria. And finally, when we come to the present-day situation, the most challenging issues are to what extent we would be able to agree or disagree on the future in Syria and on do's and don'ts of common fight against ISIL, against terrorists. Because Russia, both Russia and Turkey, have their own, so to say, agenda. You may call it hidden agenda, open agenda in Syria, which doesn't coincide. To some extent, it is overlapping. But we are well aware that Turks came to Syria because of the Kurdish factor, whereas Russia came to Syria not to allow President Assad to collapse. Now we have to come to a certain common point on that. Yeah.
Let's get Metin Gurchan's view on that. And I want to ask you as well, because this relationship is further complicated by the United States backing the YPG forces in Syria, the Kurdish forces there in their fight against ISIL. So with the US sending more of its own forces there, I mean, how does Turkey deal with that? That's not something that they're going to be happy about, is it?
I mean, north of Syria, I mean, right now, in fact, this is really a UNICEF analysis problem. At the global level, I think north of Syria is still a contested territory between Russia and US. For Russian strategic thinking, I think whole, north of Syria is a Russian area of influence. But for US strategic thinking, Euphrates River is the border, and the east of Euphrates River is the US or American area of influence, and the west of Euphrates River is the Russian area of influence. So north of Syria is still uncontested territory at the global level. At the regional level, Turkey, and Iran. Iran's increasing visibility in the north of Syria through those proxies, Iran-led, Shia militias, and the Turkey-backed Free Syrian Army. We have still ongoing clashes there. Another problem at the regional level is Turkey's fierce stance against PKK-affiliated YPG. Turkey does not want YPG to be a main actor, in the fight against ISIS, particularly in the Raqqa offense. You see, we have a forthcoming, Raqqa offense at the moment. And right now, Turkey has been trying to accommodate both Russia and US. But for me, this is my suggestion. At the end of the day, I think Ankara will have to choose either Moscow or Washington to maintain its strategic interest in the north of Syria. And the outcome of this decision will be very influential for Turkey's, course for the future, and also for Turkey's foreign policy tailoring. And let me say another issue. For the Turkish perspective, as I said before, it's easy to explain this strategic relationship between Russia and Turkey, despite all these crises, such as the downing of Russian jet in the November of 2015 and the killing of Russian ambassador in Turkey's capital in the December of 2016 by a Turkish policeman. The economic ties, the problems with US and Western security bloc, and the third issue is, the diverging interest with Russia and the same vision in the post-ISIS setting. But the question I think we have to ask, why does Moscow is so eager to maintain this strategic relationship between Turkey despite all these crises? And my answer to this question is very simple. I think Moscow has been trying to, by using Ankara as a Trojan horse, I would say, and by making Ankara change its geo-strategic orientations, traditionally said.
Lily Gevorgian,
yes.
If I could turn back to you on this, how are given that Turkey is a member of NATO, how are its NATO allies going to view this warming of relations with Russia? Are they going to look suspiciously on that?
Well, I think this is nothing new. It's been a few years now that I think the NATO allies are quite concerned about the foreign policy decisions that Turkey is taking, and also the domestic developments. What has been happening in recent years in Turkey under President Erdogan are developments that are probably quite welcomed by the Kremlin. You're really seeing Turkey moving towards a political system that is very much fitting to the countries that are in the Eurasia Union led by Russia, so more autocratic and moving away from democratic principles and so forth. It is not an isolated issue, the political changes, because ultimately it has an impact also on Turkey's foreign policy decisions and how it acts, and the criticism that it receives for its domestic policies is also creating frustration that sometimes Turkey takes out in its foreign policy relations and in its relations with NATO, sort of routinely reminding that it's still a very important strategically well-placed ally for NATO. From Russian perspective, developing ties with somewhat disgruntled NATO member is a reminder to the military bloc of its influences. And I want to make a point. I think Turkish-Russian current alliance, a strategic partnership, in a way is a leverage. Both countries are using, almost showcasing this partnership to the West and to the NATO to remind that they have other options. But to me, this is only to strengthen their negotiating position with the West, their ultimate partner or interlocutor. So I think, yes, NATO, to answer your question, is concerned, but at the same time, they are aware that to a degree, Turkey showcasing its partnership with Russia is perhaps a negotiating tactics.
What's your view on that then, Sergei Strokhan? Do you think Turkey is kind of positioning Russia to make itself give itself a stronger hand in their dealings with their European partners?
Well, what is common between President Putin and President Erdogan is that both have troubled relations with the West, and that's why one may say that Turkey is trying to play Russian cards in its relationship with the West, while Russia is trying to play Turkish card. But having said that, I don't think that the only thing which can bring both leaders together is the necessity to perform a delicate balancing act in the relationship with the West, and to find more arguments to show that their position is strong. Again, getting back to Syria, the game in Syria is far from being over, and no one knows who would emerge as the major winner and the major loser. So while there was a lot of talk between a mysterious, enigmatic, big deal between President Putin and President Trump, there are no any visible signs that we will be able to reach that deal, including on Syria, with President Trump. However, it looks that it's quite practical to see the big deal between Russia and Turkey on Syria, and this is something very serious, because if both sides agree on the future in Syria, if both sides join their hands in first ensuring that Syria will remain as a sovereign unified state, second, that there will be a swift transition period, political process, and third, that Islamic terrorism would be wiped out, then both Russia and Turkey would emerge as the major winners. And both guests were talking about the United States, but my question is, where is the United States? We've seen President Trump inauguration speech, which was dated back to January 20, but we have not seen any real political activity on the part of President Trump, except vague statements that we need to fight ISIL. That's all what we see at the moment. So what is the role of the United States? It's nowhere so far. And Obama has gone. That's why it is Russia and Turkey who are playing the major role in Syria today.
And on that, we're going to have to leave it. Mertin Gurcan, Sergei Strokhan, and Lilit Gevorgyan, thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And as always, thank you for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. You can join the conversation there. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hazem Sika, and the whole team here, bye for now.